Before the next episode of X Job Downloaded starts, I have a big favour to ask. If you've enjoyed any of our episodes so far, please can you click on the follow button on your platform. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon and YouTube. It costs nothing to follow, but makes a real difference to me as a podcast producer. Thank you. My name is Paul Maleary, and for 30 years I served with Essex Police. During this time I interviewed suspects for murder, abduction, rape and extortion, plus a variety of other crimes. Now I interview former police and military personnel and anybody else who has an interesting story to tell. Sit back and listen to X Job Downloaded.
I will at least personally try to do the job as professionally as I can.
Yeah.
And I will try and get everyone else to do it as professionally as they can. But it just wasn't the way back then, because apart from anything else, senior officers would only issue 2 firearms, because it said in police orders that authorised firearms officers should be deployed in pairs. So they took it as, well, they only need 2 then, don't they?
Oh, my God.
And so that is why Cherry Gross got killed.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, because they all went crashing in with 2 guns. If they'd have done, if they'd have called her out, she'd have come sleepy to the door and go, no, you can come in and have a look, but my son's not here.
Yeah.
She certainly wouldn't have got shot. But that was the way things were done. And so, just as I said, just after I joined, they introduced a 3 or a 4 year posting policy to the Special Patrol Group. And so I knew, by this time I had about 2 years on the SPG, I knew that if I applied for the firearms unit, it would probably be 2 or 3 years before, 1 or 2 years before I would actually transfer.
Yeah.
So I'd see my time out on the SPG. And what made me think about going to the firearms unit was we did an anti-terrorist, counter-terrorist exercise. And it was up at Lippitts Hill.
Yeah.
So you'll probably know Lippitts because it's Essex.
Oh, no, well, it's where the helicopters.
But back then, of course, it was still part of the MPD. And it was an old Second World War prisoner of war camp. And I'd heard about it, but I hadn't yet done my shots course. So we went up there to do this exercise. And our job as a Special Patrol Group was to search, believe it or not, bearing in mind this was about 1982, for dirty bombs. Yeah, I mean, most people never heard of dirty bombs until we started talking about Osama bin Laden and the global war on terrorism. But they've been, in theory, they've been around for a long time. So we'd had to go down to Aldermaston and be taught how to search for these bombs, which I've got to be honest wasn't difficult. They gave you a box with a little light and an aerial on it. You turned it on and it went beep 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 beep. Which is probably why they gave it to the SPG, because to be honest, you could have.
It's the only thing you couldn't break.
A performing monkey, with enough bananas, you could have taught them to do the job. So anyway, we went up there, and the SAS were there.
Right.
I didn't realise they were the SAS because they all looked about 12, and I was only a youngster still myself, But these guys looked about 12 in black coveralls, running around doing stuff. No guns and bombs and bullets or anything. But while we were searching for the bombs, we see a door that's marked SP team. So my mate goes, "Oh, they've allocated a room for the Special Patrol Group, SP, Special Patrol." So we opened the door, and it was obviously the squadron holding area. And there's this big Glaswegian with a Zapata moustache, dripping in bombs and bullets. And he goes, "How can I help you, gentlemen?" And my mate goes, "Yeah, we need to search this." And he goes, "Well, you can fuck off." And he slammed the door in my face. I'm like, "Oh, right." So that'd be the SAS. And then while I was up there, there was a guy called Clive who had been one of my best mates at Lewisham. And round about the same time I went to the SPG, he joined D11 as its youngest ever instructor.
Right.
Clive was about a year younger than me. They were actively recruiting younger officers because they now had the operational role since 1975. They'd existed as a training unit since 1967. So you've heard of Foxtrot 1-1, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, Foxtrot 1-1 was what we called a Q car in the Met, which was an unmarked car manned by an advanced driver, a detective sergeant, and a detective constable, all in plain clothes, obviously, and 3 officers on F districts, which was sort of West London. 3 of them were shot to death by 3 guys. One of whom was Harry Roberts.
Yeah.
Who's become infamous.
August 1966, wasn't it? Shepherd's
Bush.
It
was literally a couple of weeks after we won the World Cup.
Yeah.
It was like, swinging 60s,
Yeah.
London was the place to be, blah, blah, blah. And these 3 officers were killed. And it was only a year after we'd done away with the death sentence. And so you can imagine if you imagine if 3 police officers were killed in one incident today, with tasers and batons and ARVs and all the rest of it, it would still be considered a horrendous, game-changing situation.
Yeah.
But the Met and the government did what they always do when a police officer gets killed and there's a cry to arm the police. They give a little concession. They kick the tin can a little further down the street to put off that fateful day where we might have to arm everybody. And what they did is it became apparent that the police weren't prepared for an incident like the hunt for Harry Roberts. There was no formal firearms training. It could literally be. I didn't used to be in the army. Yeah. I was in the catering corps. Well, there you go. There's a Webley and 6 rounds of ammunition go off, and it was literally like that.
Yeah.
And so they went, well, that's got to stop. So we need to formalise the training, and we need to make sure that everybody's trained to a suitable standard. So they formed a unit that very quickly was allocated the call sign D11. And the reason for that was B department covered all training. So I can't remember it now, but I think D8 was recruit training.
Right.
D6 was probably the driving school, and D11 was formed as the firearms unit. So all they were instructors. They had no operational role other than to take CS to the scene of incidents and deploy CS, but that was a very, very, very rare event. But then, because of international terrorism, because of the Munich Olympic Games and all the rest of it, the government told 22 SAS that they had to form a counter-terrorist wing, which they did, which probably saved the regiment from being disbanded, in all honesty.
Yeah.
And the Home Secretary turned around to the Commissioner of the Met and said, you need a tactical team that is capable of responding to a situation and containing it, and perhaps even resolving it prior to 22 SAS arriving.
Yeah.
So they looked at all the options. The Special Patrol Group was an option, but that was already becoming controversial. And so they decided for the least, what's the word I'm looking for?
Line of resistance?
Yeah, what they did is they went, well, why don't we give it to the firearms instructors? Because they're all ex-military guys by and large. They handle guns every day. They've already got this limited operational role of turning up at the scene of incidents with CS. Why don't we form them into teams? And I'm sure it was probably just given to the Home Office as one of the options. And the Home Office went, oh, that sounds the safest. But there was less than 30 of them. So they were split into 4 teams of 5 guys, something like that.
Yeah.
It wasn't really capable of anything, but they gave them a budget and they bought them submachine guns and, armoured vehicles and all sorts of things. But then they never really used them. So from 1975 through till when I joined the unit in 83, they trained a lot. They did the occasional job. But for the most part, armed operations were conducted by the people that they trained.
Right.
So the flying squad would continue to run their own operations. They weren't going to use a load of wooden tops with berets on to do their job for them. Divisional officers, Sherry Gross, the lady that was shot and paralysed in Brixton in 1985, would it have been? Round about then.
Around then, yeah.
The officer that actually shot Cherry Gross inadvertently was the local duty officer Dougie Lovelock.
Oh, wow.
He was the inspector, and he had actually asked his commander to use the firearms unit. He said, "This isn't a job for us." He said, "This guy's fired a shotgun at Hertfordshire detectives. We ought to have the professionals dealing with it." But because the London Borough of Lambeth and Brixton always been politically sensitive, or we don't want strangers coming in and doing it. No, sir, Inspector, you do it. Your men can do it. And because he was one of these old style inspectors that led from the front, he went, right, well, if I'm not going to ask the troops to do something I won't do. They'd only authorised two revolvers. So him and another lad and some unarmed guys went crashing through the door at 3 a.m, and the result was Cherry Groves getting shot and riots. And those riots then led on to more riots in Tottenham, which of course resulted in the brutal murder of a police officer.
Keith Blakelock. November 85.
Yeah. And so these things have consequences, but in an attempt to try and it's a little bit like the police are still doing it to this day. I mean, one of the reasons that they've made a huge thing about naming the driver at in Liverpool of being a 53-year-old white man, and I kind of sympathise with the flack they're getting for it, because they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't.
Oh, absolutely.
But when we had the Southport killings, we didn't say who they were, and then we tried to make out that he was a Christian guy from Wales, which I suppose technically he was. And they've never been very good at winning that war of words, have they?
No, they're not transparent enough. So you're on D11. This is 1983, did you say?
So I did my instructor's course in 1983, and actually my first day of my instructor's course coincided with another famous Met Police firearms fuck up, which was the Yellow Mini Saga. Do you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the Yellow Mini Saga? Right. So there was a guy, and his name escapes me right now, but I read a book about him, and I wanted to do a whole chapter in my book about this guy because he was intriguing. He was a heterosexual burglar, but he was like a master burglar. I'm talking about the sort of burglar that would pick locks and like a proper burglar. But he was also a cross-dresser. He liked dressing as a woman, and he would use that when he was carrying out reconnaissance, and sometimes when he was actually committing some of these crimes.
Well, I never.
And he had robbed a gun shop in New Row in Covent Garden.
Right.
Which is no longer there, but I used to love going in there. Whenever I went up the West End as a kid, I'd always go to New Row, and I'd go into Thomas Bland's gun shop and look at all the guns, because back then handguns were legal, and I'd see guns like under the glass that and I'd get to handle them that I'd only ever seen pictures of in books. So he had burgled Thomas Bland's. He bypassed all the alarm system.
Wow.
Got in without causing any damage, and stolen a shitload of guns and ammunition. I mean, a shitload of guns and ammunition. I'm talking probably about 50, 60 guns, something like that. A lot of ammunition. And he was habitually carrying them. And he was also selling them to the criminal, to the underworld. But one of the other things that he was doing, bearing in mind that this is like 1983, is we were still in that moment in time where we didn't know whether we were going to buy Betamax or VHS.
VHS, yeah.
But videos were the big thing. And video porn was massive.
It was.
So what this guy was doing, in addition to gun shops, he was burglarizing. Is that an Americanism or is that an English thing?
That is an Americanism.
He was burglarizing.
Burglarizing. Yeah.
He was video editing suites.
Oh, okay.
People that specialised in videos, which were mainly up the West End, because that's where the film industry was.
Yeah.
And what he would do, he did on one occasion anyway, I don't know how he did it on other occasions, but he would burglarise it early in the evening, dressed as a security guard, as a cover story, and then he would spend the whole evening running off copies of porn and then selling it. But in any case, he's in one of these places, and it's somewhere up near Marylebone. And I don't know whether it was a cleaner or another member of staff or someone else sees the lights on, thinks it's suspicious, and calls the police. So the police arrive, And he's completely credible. He's got like a laminated photo ID card. He's got all the right answers. But copper's instinct, a couple of the coppers just aren't happy. They're not happy with it. But they've been doing checks and they've been asking for phone calls and also over the radio. So the duty officer, the inspector, who's got a female police constable out with him in his GP car, his general purpose car, thinks, this sounds like it's dragging on. I'll go along and see what's going on. So he goes along and he listens to the bad guy's story and says to the coppers, right, out of earshot, sounds pretty credible to me, lads. Just finish this off, will you? And, whatever. So anyway, one of the coppers goes off to do another radio check so that he can be out of earshot of the bad guy. And while he's there, the bad guy sees an opportunity to escape. So the one remaining copper with him tackles him.
Right.
The bad guy pulls a gun and shoots the officer in the femoral artery.
Oh, Christ.
And escapes. So urgent assistance call. Fortunately, it's central London, so there's armed units from the Diplomatic Protection Group turn up, one of whom was my best mate. And they basically stop an arterial bleed, and manage to save this guy's life. And they get to hospital and the copper survives. But there's now a huge manhunt for this guy. Somehow they get an address for him and the detectives sit up on it. I'm not sure whether the flying squad were involved at this point or whether, rather like I suggested earlier, the locals have said, right, we're going to form a squad to get this bloke. Yeah. But they had information that he was living in this flat. Anyway, you can picture the scene. They've got units in cars outside the address and a Mini pulls up and this little dolly bird gets out, or quite a tall dolly bird, with stocking tops just on show above a mini skirt. And you can imagine the comments in the car, sort of circa 1980s. Oh, look at you, wouldn't you? All this sort of stuff. Anyway, girl goes in and goes to the flat door. So the coppers that are inside the building think, right, well, if she opens the door, it's obviously the girlfriend. If she opens the door, we can just bomb burst in after her.
Yeah.
And speak to her and find out where he wants. Anyway, it's him. He produces a gun and fires a shot, doesn't hit anybody. They wrestle the gun off of him. One of the cops has got his revolver out and is pointing at him and shouting, "Oh, please fire it." He's fighting like a wildcat in drag, reaches down into his knickers and pulls out a little 2.5 pocket pistol, which he was carrying as a backup, and shoots another copper, but only wounds him. At which point, the authorised firearms officer fires a shot and wounds the suspect, and the suspect is taken into custody. It's central London, so he goes to Marlborough Street Magistrates Court. Do you know where that is? Yeah. Top end of Carnaby Street, Yep. Right on the junction. And it backs on to London Palladium. This suspect, who's in custody, probably at Brixton Prison or somewhere like that, gets taken to Marlborough Street Magistrates Court for a hearing, and he's smuggled in a homemade lockpick, which they think was in his mouth. Yeah, or hidden in his hair. He picks a cell lock. How difficult must that be? Right? Escapes through the building, they believe, up onto the roof, where he gets, they think, into the London Palladium, where he hides up until it opens up, probably sits in through a show, and then walks out with a matinee crowd and escapes. So now there's an even bigger manhunt. And they know he's got a girlfriend, and they've got the girlfriend under observation. And on a rainy night in November in Kensington, which is where she lived, they see her come out of the flat and get into a car with a guy, with two other guys. But one of the guy is a ringer for the suspect that they're after. A guy called, his name was David Martin, right? Is the bad guy. He's got a very prominent sort of like beaky nose and long hair. So this guy sits in the front passenger seat of this bright yellow Mini, and off they drive, followed by a surveillance team. They haven't gone far when they get stuck in like Friday night traffic in the Kensington Knightsbridge sort of area. So they send a couple of footies, a couple of surveillance officers on foot to get a good look at this suspect. And the guy that they choose to send forward to have a good look at this guy is the guy that had a good look at him before because he shot him.
Oh.
They actually send the firearms officer forward because he's not suspended or anything. It's only a couple of weeks later. So this guy clearly is thinking to himself, well, if I have to shoot you this time, I'm going to shoot you properly. So he gets the gun out, and he holds his own gun out, and he holds it down behind his leg, sort of conceals it, and he walks along, and he looks into the car. And the guy in the front passenger seat turns round and looks, and their eyes meet. Nothing more in it than that. And at the same time, he reaches back into the back seat and asks the guy in the back seat to hand him the A to Z map because they're stuck in traffic.
Oh, no.
The copper thinks he's going for a gun and opens fire. Two of his colleagues hear the gunshots, see the flashes inside the vehicle and think that that's incoming and return fire. He gets hit 2 or 3 times. The girl gets out of the car and runs into the night. Eventually, she's found. The bloke in the black seat doesn't get hit at all. So anyway, the guy that was dragged out of the car, and I feel really bad because I can't remember his name now. But he was a total innocent.
Oh, Christ!
I say a total innocent. There's all sorts of suggestions, and it's quite probable that because he looked very much like David Martin, and the girlfriend suspected that her phone was tapped, that they may well have been using him as a decoy,
right,
to take the police away. But anyway, tragic consequences. The guy that was shot, it's really annoying me now, but he was miraculously not seriously injured, mainly due to the power of the ammunition that we were using at the time. He was also pistol whipped in the street. 2 of the officers, the officer that fired the first shot and another officer, were both charged with attempted murder.
Right.
David Martin goes to court and is found guilty. Number 1 court at the Old Bailey. Guess what the next trial was? Same week.
No.
The 2 officers were in the same court, and they were found not guilty.
Wow.
And so that happened literally a week or so before I was due to go on my firearms instructor's course. And there was a big review of police tactics and police training as a direct result of that. So that shortly after I joined as an instructor, having completed my 6-week instructor's course, a 2-week basic firearms course was designed. So it doubled the training with a much greater concentration on tactics.
Right.
And there were other things that came out of it, sort of very early senior officer training came out of it. But again, piecemeal, kick that tin can a little bit further down the street sort of thing. Yeah.
So when you were there, was Tony Kelly at the down at...
Tony Kelly, Sprog. No, so Tony, I'll tell you when Tony Kelly came in. Like I said, so just going back to where I was, I'm now a firearms instructor, which means that I'm spending 3 weeks out of every 4 on an indoor range, normally Croydon or Marylebone or Grays City Road, in the basement of a police station, teaching the 4,800 authorised shots how to shoot a gun, teaching them a bit about tactics. Or I'm up at Lippitts Hill running 2-week basic courses periodically. But 1 week in 4. I parade at Old Street on a Monday morning. I pick up my pager, and me and my 8-man D11 team. I was on blue team. We would be the call-out team for the whole of London for that week. If something major came in, so in 1984, for instance, the year after I joined, we had the Libyan People's Bureau siege. All that would happen is all training would stop. And all of the instructors would be dragged in from the ranges so that we had 4 teams. So we had 16 guys on the early shift or day shift, 16 guys on the night shift, and there'd be no training for other firearms officers in the Met until that operation was concluded. And that's kind of the way that it operated. But because of all of these fuck-ups, for want of a better word, because of things like the Yellow Mini Saga, because of the incident in Brixton, local senior officers were becoming more reluctant to use their own guys.
Yeah.
And so we were starting to get used more often. Still not in places like Brixton, where they still wanted their own guys to do it. Periodically, you might get a job at Brixton, but we were starting to get used more and more and more. And what that meant was we couldn't cope with the volume of work and the training.
No.
And so what happened is in 1987, having been D11 since 1967, we changed our name because D department became personnel and training, or PT.
Right.
And we became PT 17.
Right.
And that coincided with something that had come about as a result of these tragic screw ups, was that it had been suggested that there was various options, one of which was each geographical area of the Met should have its own firearms unit.
Yeah.
Now, some commanders were dead in favour of that. Oh, yeah, I want my own little team of gunmen. Others didn't want anything to do with it. I don't go, no. So what they resolved was that actually we would give additional manpower to PT-17 who would be non-instructors, and they would be brought in as level 2. So the old instructional teams that I'd been part of would become level 1 teams, and our primary responsibility would be counter-terrorism, suspects with exceptional firepower or hostage situations. And then we'd have level 2 teams who would only be armed with revolvers. So they'd be pretty much like divisional shots, but they would actually be attached to us, and they would be supervised by a level 1 sergeant.
Right.
So Tony Calley, going back to your question, I'm sure he'll be love to be mentioned on here, but so TK, or the Greek as he was better known, he came in as part of that first wave of level 2.
Right.
And then did an instructor's course himself and became level 1, and then history rolled on.
Yeah. I know Tony. And Barry Oldroyd Jones.
Barry made up name. Yeah.
Because he got shot, didn't he?
He got shot. Apparently, he got shot. I've never heard him talk about it, but apparently.
Yeah. No, I play golf with him, so
he's still got pellets in him, I think, from 1980, whenever it was. No, sorry, 1992, 93, something like that.
Mick Gammons, he's a friend of mine.
Yeah. Mick was on my team. Yeah.
Was he? Yeah, I still see him. He does a bit of work for us, actually. But
is he?
Yeah, I still see him about. He lived up the road from me. But yeah, I know a few of the guys from there. So we can talk for hours, mate, because I think we've both got that in our makeup, and I'm quite happy to talk for as long as you want to talk. But with the Yvonne Fletcher, did you get deployed to St James's?
Yeah. I was so Green Team were the on-call team, and Green Team always worked with Orange Team, and Red Team always worked with Blue Team.
Right.
And I was on Blue Team. So the first people on scene from D11 were like 6 to 8 guys from Green Team, because they were on duty with guns and went straight to the scene. When they cancelled training, they closed all the ranges. We all made our way to the scene, and then it was obvious that it was going to go long. So because Green Team had been on duty first, they took over the day team, the 12-hour day shift, together with Orange Team, and Red Team and Blue Team. We got sent home. Right. So I was on scene for probably about 3 or 4 hours. I went around, like I mentioned earlier, I'm quite good at art. So I visited all of the main containment positions, doing sketch plans and did all the target indication and colour coded it and all that sort of stuff. And then did drawings in the control room, like on big full scat paper, so that we had plans and stuff.
Wow.
And then a decision was made that Red and Blue Team would go home and we would re-parade at, I don't know, 10 o'clock at night or something, which we did. And from that point on, for the duration of the scene, I was night duty, covering it. I did a car. The SAS were there. I say the SAS were there. They weren't really. There was a couple of guys from the regiment there, and there were spooks there as well, and all the rest of it. And they had their own little offices and places. But we had quite a good relationship with Hereford, because we used to train with them a lot and go up to Hereford and train. And the 2 guys that were down were the 2 guys that used to look after us from what was CRW, Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing. So, we helped them out securing stuff that they needed, little stuff, like, got to roll the black masking tape, or, can you get us a telephone line in, and all that sort of stuff. And they helped us out. But the main body of the SAS, their assault squadron, were based at a barracks nearby, and they would come down on night duty and do recce's. Now, there was absolutely nothing for them to do. They were never going to. There was never going to be an Iranian embassy siege because there were no hostages.
No.
So basically what it turned into a big board exercise. What if they did have hostages? How would we mount the assault? How would we do this? How would we do it? And we were having to escort them around the building. And it was taking a lot of time, and we had things to do. We were supposed to be containing, we were involved, albeit in the containment aspect of it, in like the biggest murder inquiry that we'd had in the Metropolitan Police for years,
Yes, yeah.
So they became a bit of a distraction. And we were sitting in the control room one night. We all used to take it in turns to go in the control room for an hour and grab a break from being on containment. And someone was talking about the SAS and their what their plans were. So I drew a cartoon because it was Easter. I drew a cartoon of an SAS bloke dressed up as an Easter bunny with his body armour on and his MP5 slung around the back, pushing an Easter egg on wheels, like with a little slot on it and a pair of eyes looking out, And I put down option 1 because they kept coming up with all these options. So option 1, because it was Easter, was the Easter bunny thing. So that did the rounds, and that ended up getting copied off. Reams and reams of them were copied up, and they were put up all around the thing. Then the SAS blokes came to us and said, "Oh, the young troop commander for B Squadron, or for the particular troop that were doing something, is a guards officer. He's into motocross, and also he's into parachuting, and he smokes cigars. Can you do a cartoon of him because it's his birthday?" And I was like, "What?" So I ended up doing a cartoon of that. And then I did option 2, which was, bearing in mind the sort of the Libyan side of all of this, I drew a wooden camel with the side taken off of it, with all of these SAS blokes all squeezed in, and one SAS bloke leaning up against it, saying to another one, "Even Gaddafi isn't stupid enough to fall for this stunt." So that was the Trojan camel. And then people just kept coming to me, going, "Oh, can you do us a cartoon of this and a cartoon of that and a cartoon of the other?" And it sort of got around that I wasn't actually involved in the Libyan People's Bureau siege at all. All I did was sit in the warm drawing cartoon.
Have you still got them?
It wasn't totally true, but
have you still got them?
Yeah, I have actually. Yeah.
You should get them on Antiques Roadshow. Oh, Mark Smith will probably love all that.
Yeah.
When was your first? Like you have been unkindly called by papers a number of different things, but you were titled, and please forgive me, but they used the name as the Commissioner's Assassin in one headline.
Well, you've read one that I didn't read. Then I've never heard that one.
Yeah, so
I've heard the Met's own serial killer.
Yeah,
that was actually from Sue Akers, who was a female commander in charge of the Directorate of Professional Standards when she said it to me.
No way.
Yeah.
It's quite hurtful, isn't it? You're doing a job.
It started. It's the newspapers, all right. I've actually, because I've written a book, and because you have to kind of speak to journalists, and I've been on TV and radio broadcasting things, and that they're all journalists at heart. I've got to know a few, and I get to know how they tick, and some of them I class as friends.
Yes.
And they're the ones that are honest enough to admit that integrity. Some people will try. A lot of journalists will try and defend journalism as, we're the people that make sure that the government does what it's supposed to do, and undoubtedly there are journalists who feel that way and do a good job of exposing stuff. But equally, there's a lot of journalists who got on well with 1970s detectives, because they were just like 1970s detectives. They weren't
absolutely.
They weren't convinced. They didn't have to be the truth. They were quite happy to gild the lily. And if making a good headline means calling Tony Long the equaliser, or calling Tony Long, the eliminator, they'll just make shit up. And that's exactly what happened. So when I got involved in my first shooting in 1985, which was a domestic siege, and they only found out my name when I got to give evidence at the Old Bailey because the guy I shot survived.
Right.
There wasn't much made of it then because, of course, when someone's convicted at court, it's not headlines, is it?
No.
You know, it was yesterday's chit wrapper by that point. They're not really interested. It's page 5. So they just mentioned, you know, the officer aged 30, greets Constable Anthony Long, blah, 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 blah. When I got involved in my second incident, which was sort of 18 months later, it was headline news because I'd shot 3 suspects that were committing an armed robbery, and 2 of those had died. So it was like national headlines. And the Sun chose the headline, "The Equaliser," and it showed a picture of a Browning high-power pistol. And it said, with this pistol, a single officer, you know, shot 3 armed suspects, da, 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 da. Now, it didn't say that my nickname was the Equaliser. It's just that it was, you know, it was a TV show, wasn't it? You know, and,
it was, yeah.
And pistols historically in the Wild West were quite often referred to as equalisers, you know, because a little petite female with a revolver was just as dangerous as a big man with a revolver. So the equaliser, I kind of get that. But of course, it became a bit of banter. So when I walked in the canteen that first morning, oh, the equaliser's here, you know. But from that point on, it was never said. But what the press are obsessed with is this dark humour that does exist, but they're convinced that we all have like war-y nicknames, like they're all Americans, you know, and we don't, you know.
We don't.
I'm actually not aware that I had any. On the SPG, I was called No Tease Tony. I wasn't actually called No Tease Tony, but someone had written No Tease Tony in the hat band, in my cap band.
Right,
and that was because it was suggested that I was always a bit backward at coming forward to buy a round of teas, and there was some truth in that because, as I said, I was a welfare case. You know, I was still in married quarters. Yeah, I still didn't have a pot to piss in. By this time I had 2 kids. You know? So it wasn't that I wouldn't spend my money. It's just that I didn't have any.
Have any to spend. No.
So that's about the only nickname. Other people might have called me a ginger wanker or whatever. I don't know. But nobody had nicknames like that.
No.
You know, the most common nickname I had was TL. If you asked anybody what was Tony,
that's what they refer to it. Yeah, absolutely.
That's not to say there weren't nicknames, but normally if somebody had a war-y nickname, it was because he was an idiot. You know, if somebody was called, you know, I don't know, looking Mad Fox or something, it'd probably because he was like
because they were mad.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I don't know how we got onto that. How did we get onto that?
Yeah, no. So it was the headlines. But so when you are, I mean, you've given your evidence, the Old Bailey domestic. The first time you shot someone, and this is all covered in your book, but what was that like for you as an individual? You know, you're a nice bloke. I enjoy your company. We've got the same friends within the media. You know, in fact, the last time I saw you was at Yvonne Fletcher's Memorial Day.
That's right.
In April. So, you know, we've got a lot of common ground, a lot of common people that we know. But how did that impact on you the first time you were involved in a fatal shooting? What was that like, and how were you dealt with by the police service?
There's actually a number of answers wrapped up in that sort of like 2 questions there, really. Yeah. How I felt at the moment of pulling the trigger was, well, this is it. You've done it now. You've just killed someone. And I actually remember, you know, when you find yourself in a shooting situation or any situation for that matter, you know, that's where adrenaline is flowing, time stands still, and you have time to have long drawn out thoughts that, you know, you wouldn't actually, you know, in ordinary times fit into that time frame. No. But I remember as I was shooting thinking, you know, I can't see my sights. I'm going to have to, you know, shoot him in the head. I remember when I fired the 3rd shot into his head, I remember seeing his eyes roll up into his head and thinking to myself, the exact words in my head were, well, you've done it now. You've actually killed someone. And it was completely unknown territory because although the unit had had its operational role since November 1975, and here we were in December 1985, you know, in those 10 years, they'd never fired a shot in anger.
Wow.
The only time they discharged their weapon was to put down a bull that escaped from an abattoir, and that was about it. There'd never been another occasion. And nobody knew what was going to happen. In fact, the old and the bold, quite a lot of the older guys were quite against the operational role. They were like, I didn't sign up for this. This isn't what I joined to do. If I wanted to be in the SAS, I'd have joined the SAS, you know. And a lot of them, well, you know what's going to happen. If anybody, you know, fires a gun, they'll be straight back to borough. They're going to get RTU'd, return to unit, because, you know, we're very proud of our broken record of never having to fire a shot, because our tactics are so good, and because we take the slowly catchy monkey approach and work hand in glove with the negotiators, you know, we'll never have to fire a shot. And if we do, you know, it'll probably be an unnecessary shot, and that person should be, you know, dealt with. So that's what I thought. I thought, well, you're probably going to have to find another job now, Tony. That's what I thought to start with. And I left the building with the little girl, and there's a theme that runs through all of the shooting incidents that I found myself in, and I call it guilt. I can't honestly say I felt guilty, but what I did feel was an overwhelming urge to get away from what it was that I'd done.
Yeah.
And the passport out of that little living room in a council flat in Northolt was to pick up the little girl who'd been stabbed in front of me as I'm shooting, and get her out of Dodge, basically.
Yeah.
You know, it was like pick her up, slap a shell dressing on her neck, and get her down to the ambulance that I know's downstairs as quick as I possibly can. And I remember handing over the little girl, and as I walked back up the stairs, I remember, you know, like the two, you know, the devil and the angel on your shoulder talking, you know, oh, go back and see what you did, you know, don't be a twat. Go and, you know, go back to the control room. So, you know, the policeman in me wanted to go back and seen what I'd done, and the voice of reason said, no, you don't need to see that. Go and make yourself busy. Carry on being busy. So I went back to the control room and I started making bacon sandwiches and everything for the troops. But I was absolutely convinced that the man was dead. And one of the guys on the team's older guy, ex-serviceman, cracking guy, came in and gave me a bit of a man hug. And you know, this was the 1980s. We didn't really do man hugs, you know, a decade before its time, really. So he said, oh, mate, I'm so sorry. I said, what are you sorry about? He said, oh, I didn't shoot him. I should have shot him as well. I said, well, no, there was no need to shoot him. No, but we've got a thing on Green Team that if my mate shoots someone, I shoot him as well. I went, what? You know, and it was just ridiculous, and it was born out of a complete lack of experience, because we'd never been involved in the shooting before. It was like gung-ho bravado, and it was like, right, well, you know, if I shoot him as well, then that'll prove that two of us realised he needed shooting, you know. And I'd heard them talking about this over a beer, and I told them then it was bollocks. I said, that's rubbish. I said, that's never going to happen, you know. So you burst into a room and shoot the wrong person. You shoot some, you know, elderly woman doing her knitting. You're going to come in and shoot her as well, are you? Just to prove that, you know, it's nonsense. What are you talking about? So he goes, well, I said, you know, he was there. He goes, and he said, well, I said to him, don't worry about it. I said, it's all immaterial. They're both dead anyway. And he went, but no, he's not, Tony. And I went, what? He said, after you left the room, he said, I'm holding my gun, pointing at him, thinking, I can't shoot him. You know, I can't, you know. He said, I just decided I really, really couldn't shoot him. There was no point. And his eyes popped open. And he said, finish me off.
No.
Yeah. So I'd gone in one moment from thinking I'd you know, taken a human life to realising that I hadn't. He had been shot in the brain, so I knew that it was still touch and go. But this is the way the job look at it. All right. So we left the scene. We went and wrote our notes at the local police station. It's Boxing Day, so it's Christmas. You know, it's Christmas time. The police station was like a ghost town. Yeah. And we found an empty CID office that had some milk in the fridge and a kettle. And we made ourselves some brews, and we wrote our notes, and we watched it on the telly. We watched the actual on the news. And the guy that I was just telling you about, he got hit in the hand with a riot shield, trying to stop the suspect getting back in the house. And the guy had the riot shield in his hand. He threw it at Tony, and it nearly broke his finger. And he couldn't work out why his finger hurt so much. He didn't even see that riot shield.
Wow.
He only knew about the riot shield because he saw it on the telly
TV.
after the adrenaline had stopped flowing. So we get told we've got to wait because the local commander wants to come and see us. All right. Now, the hostage, the little girl that I'd taken out was a 4-year-old girl. She'd been tortured over 2 days in front of the negotiators. Okay. But because he was a black man and she was a little black girl, they were so obsessed post the Tottenham riots, post Cherry Gross, that if we shot a black man when there was an angry black crowd outside, that we'd have more rights on our hand. But they completely misread their audience. If they'd have actually taken the time to speak to the people in that crowd would have told them that they were furious that the police weren't breaking into that house and rescuing that little girl and shooting that black man, because he'd already murdered a black woman and thrown her body out the window and was now holding this little black girl hostage. So anyway, we wait, and the commander for the area, who was they didn't have gold and silver then, but he should have been the gold commander, really. Yeah. He came in and he said, "Oh, who fired the shot?" And everybody looked at me, and I went, "Me." He said, "Well, it wasn't very good shooting, was it?" And I was like, "Bite your lip, Tony. Now's not the time." And he said, "Right, I want you all to know," he said, "that I was giving a press release with a building behind me when you chose to ignore my direct orders and carry out a rescue mission." He said, "I want you to know that when I heard those stun grenades going off, my first instinct was that none of you would be in the Metropolitan Police tomorrow. You would all be sacked without your pensions." And then he said, "But you'll be glad to hear that the little girl is going to make it. And more importantly, so is Errol Walker. And therefore you have my wholehearted support."
Oh dear. Honestly. I wonder if Errol Walker's still around.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. When I did a documentary about it, and while I was being filmed and everything else, a friend of mine who was there, that was part of the production team, was going around knocking on doors to see if there was anyone on the estate that had been there and remembered it, so that we could interview them. And there was only one woman, and she wasn't prepared to be interviewed, but he found a bloke in the flats that knew Errol Walker. And he called me up. He said, "Come up to flat such and such." So like in the lunch break, I went up and he introduces me to this guy. This guy's got a ponytail. His flat stunk of cannabis. Yeah. He had earrings in. He had like all coppers of bastards on his knuckles. He had tattoos everywhere. He says, "Oh, mate," he said, "You the bloke that shot Errol Walker?" And I went, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, I'm shake your hand." And I went, and it wasn't what I was expecting at all. I didn't look anything like it. And I said, "Did you know Errol Walker?" He said, "No him." He said, "We went same school as him, same class." He said, "We used to go out thieving together. Grass. Fucking dirty fucking grass." And I went, right. And Errol Walker had been a super grass. He had been
Had he?
I think he was the first ever black supergrass in the country. He turned Queen evidence and given evidence against an armed robbery team that he was a black armed robbery team, and had been given a very short sentence, only about 2 years. He got out, and he said, "I was in Brixton." He goes, "when that was on the telly." He said, "And we're all watching the telly, and like the news comes on." He said, "And yous lot are on the balcony." He goes, "And like the whole of the wing went mental. They're all shouting, 'Old Bill, the bastards,' shooting and all the rest of it." And I started cheering. He says, when I heard the shots and you shot Errol Walker, I started cheering. He said, and everyone on the wing turned round and said, "What are you cheering at?" He said, "Gathers have just shot a fucking black bloke." And he goes, "Yeah, but the black bloke's a grass." And the whole of the wing turned on a sixpence, and I went, "Yeah!" And started cheering the Old Bill for shooting Errol Walker.
Excellent. So that was your first shot. Your second shot, it was a double fatal.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was 9 Regional Crime Squad based in South East London. That was 1987. It was a robbery team, a white sort of young, full of piss and vinegar, wanted to be like their uncles and their dads, and be like a proper armed robbery team. complete hotheads. They had access to firearms, which was described as an arsenal of firearms. And their main claim to fame was that they nearly always discharged their firearms on robberies, even when they didn't need to. So they'd robbed their car auctions down in Surrey somewhere, and they were running away, making their getaway with the money, running back to their getaway car, and a painter and decorator on some scaffolding, like 3 stories up, threw a bucket of paint at them, missed them, but one of them actually shot at him.
No.
Yeah, I mean, they were just complete hotheads. And several months previously, or a couple of months previously, 3 police officers had all been shot during a armed robbery. Uniformed officers had arrived at the scene of an armed robbery in progress at an industrial estate in Woolwich, so just down the road. One of the officers, the bullet had been stopped by his truncheon, and the other 2 had been injured. Not badly, I don't think. They got away quite lightly, but it was believed that they were the same team. And that they were going to rob this security van when it delivered wages to a meat packing factory.
Right.
And so basically, a plan was put together to ambush them. It wouldn't happen now. You know, it was a simplistic plan. I thought the plan was screwed from the very outset, if I'm honest. And I voiced that at our tactical briefing, but was shouted down by the inspector and the sergeant in charge. And what I prophesied would happen was exactly what happened. You know, we weren't able to jump out of the van and catch them before they got to the security van. They got to the security van. In fact, I was the only person looking through these holes that we drilled in the back of this hire van that actually saw the robbery unfolding. The other 2 guys in the van with me hadn't seen the suspects run across. I only managed to catch one of them, probably the last one. And so I gave the attack. The crop officer, the detective from the regional crime squad, he'd failed to see the robbery take place because he was in an OP position that once the suspects moved through the woods, he wasn't able to see the attack going. And so no one else knew the robbery was happening. I basically gave the off. I put in the attack. So I shouted, "Go." Everyone looked at me like I was strange. The team leader then reluctantly rolled up the roller shutters on this Luton van, and there's nothing there because the security van had backed into the loading bay and was now obscured by a parked lorry, which actually worked out in our favour because their adrenaline was flowing. The robbers' adrenaline were shouting. They were shouting, "Open the fucking van, fucking blow your knees off," and all this sort of stuff. They were so fired up they didn't hear like 8 or 9 coppers and 2 dogs jumping out of the back of the van and, you know, running towards them. So the first they knew of us was when I came around the corner with a ballistic shield in my hand and a pistol in the other. And we shouted, "Armed police," and they all started turning, basically. And so 3 of them, you know, it's all well and good thinking, "Oh, you know, it got put to me in court." Yeah, but you didn't need to shoot because you had other officers behind you. You know, but when you're at the front, albeit you've got a ballistic shield, you're not going to turn around to see who's with you and, you know, who's got who covered. So I fired a total of 5 shots, 2 shots at the first suspect, 2 shots at the second, and I fired a single shot. We were trained to fire pairs back then, but had I fired the second shot, I would have hit the hostage, which was the security guard who they were actually in physical contact with.
Right.
So one of the suspects, a guy called Derek Whitelock, he then ran off, threw his shotgun away underneath the van, and I arrested him together with some colleagues on the other side of the van. And the other 2, Nicky Payne and Mickey Flynn, they both died of their injuries at the scene.
Wow. And what was the response then? You know, you've already experienced a similar thing where the person didn't die, but of course they've died. What was that like?
It was very different insofar as going back to Errol Walker. I know no one even took a statement off me.
Didn't they?
As a detective, you'll find this amazing. But in the Met, when you made an arrest, you had a thing called an IRB, an incident report book, and that could be used for just about everything. You could use it. It was used for, you know, if you were writing up a domestic dispute or a landlord-tenant dispute, or, you know, a horse that's had to be put down. You know, it could be anything.
Anything, yeah.
It's literally an incident report book. You just crossed out the incident and it had an arrest report book, and you'd put in your detail. So when we got back to the police station after the Errol Walker shooting, like I said, it was a ghost town. There was no one around, and we couldn't find any IRBs. And we were instructors, we didn't do day-to-day police work, so none of us had an IRB on it. So I got a scrap of paper I had in my pocket, unfolded it. It was a bit of A4 paper, and it was a memo from the chief superintendent about making sure that we kept the ammunition returns accurate, and that we reported things daily. It's an admin thing, So I just flipped it over and I just put on date, time, place. As a result, I saw a man using a little girl as a hostage there, and I shot him. Boom. It was like half a page of that, and I just submitted that. And then when I went to the Old Bailey, I don't know, a year later or whenever it was, I get thrust this. What they were 991s? Were they the statement forms?
MG11s.
Yeah, MG11. Before internet, they were the 991, and they became the MG11s. I got given a statement form that was typed out by a typist, but she'd literally done it from my notes, which were abbreviated. So she'd literally put on DDTP, on day, date, time, place. So no one, and it occurred to me then, I went, why? No one's interviewed me. This is bizarre. And the reason is that I hadn't killed him. I'd have probably done as much damage if I'd have hit him on the head hard with a lignum vitae truncheon.
Yeah.
And he hadn't made a complaint. Right. Had he complained that the police had tried to kill him, then I would have been investigated by complaints, and they would have taken contemporaneous notes and asked for a statement from me or whatever. But because I didn't even get a complaint form, I didn't get anything.
Well, I never.
And it was almost like no one wanted to talk to you about it. It was like it had never happened. But of course, this was different. It was headline news. 18 months later, the abattoir shooting was headline news. 2 suspects were dead. Overall, we hit the crest of a wave because armed robberies in London had been hitting ridiculous levels.
Yeah.
And I've got to be honest, if you actually look back, robberies declined massively after 1987. Because they weren't quite they're quite happy to go and shoot a security guard in the knees. They weren't quite so happy when the old Bill was shooting back at them.
No.
And actually, PT-17, I've actually read a book written by a villain. Typical, I was the most dangerous wanted man in southeast London sort of thing. And he actually says in there where he goes, I was looking to change direction because the Met had created this secret unit called PT-17 who had a shoot to kill policy. Well, we clearly didn't have a shoot to kill policy because we arrested a shitload of people. We arrested way more people than we shot. But what does it matter? PSYOPs. If the bad guys want to believe there's a secret squad called PT-17 that's going to shoot them, and if that stops robberies, which it did, they all just diversified into drug dealing and running raves, didn't they?
Yeah.
So there was a lot more repercussions. It was investigated properly by Essex, actually.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. The Chief Constable of Essex was. So there was no independent police complaints sort of investigation sort of department or anything of that at the time. And so what police forces would do, if they felt that they needed to be investigated independently, they would go to another force, and they went to Essex. And
Robert Bunyard, it would have been.
I don't know. I can't remember what his name was. I only ever met the assistant chief and the detective chief superintendent that was his SIO.
Jeff Markham.
He had actually been involved in. So the day of the robbery, 2 suspects dead at the scene. The wounded guy's been taken to hospital. We eventually get driven in the back of a police van back to Elton Police Station, which is where we'd been briefed.
Yeah. As
we get out of the back of the van, everyone's looking at me because I'm the only one that hasn't got a gun in the holster. So that was one lesson learned. Don't do that again. Because I'd handed it to the exhibits officer at the scene. But a senior officer stuck his head out of the first floor window. I don't know what rank he was, but you could see he had pips or crowns or whatever. And he looked out, and it reminded me a little bit of the French character in the Monty Python film. The little French man. I spit in your general direction. He kind of looks out the window like that. And he goes, "You chaps, just come back from this shooting." And we went, yes, Gov. And he went, can you tell me, were the suspects black or white? And to this day, I regret not telling them he was black. They were black, just to see the look on his face. Because, the moment we said, no, there were 3 white guys, Gov. Like, what's the relevance? You could just see this wave of relief wash over him. So anyway, we were there for the rest of the day in the canteen, twiddling our thumbs, waiting for someone to come to speak to us. We got told quite quickly that Essex would been given the task, and we had to wait for the senior management team from Essex to turn up. And so we waited, and eventually the assistant chief turned up together with his SIO, who was the chief superintendent. And I remember the assistant chief going, obviously, we will deal with this completely impartially, and, blah, 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 as you'd expect. And I remember the detective chief superintendent, I can't remember whether he said he was the SIO for the infamous farm shooting in Essex, or whether he'd been involved in it. But he said something to the effect of, we're not going to make the same mistakes we made with that investigation. So, and I have to say that there's never really been any love lost between Essex and the Met, not at troop level, bit of banter perhaps, but there's always been a bit of a pissing competition, I think, between senior management. Yeah. And I have to say that Essex dealt with us like 100% down the line, absolutely squared away. And quite quickly they identified that it had all been above board and dealt with correctly for its time. Like I said, it probably wouldn't have been dealt with like that now, but
different era.
Yeah, absolutely. But, I think generally speaking, the press were very supportive because it was seen that we'd actually taken a positive stance against armed robbery.
But I think the public want to see that, I think the public get fed up with wannabe gangsters driving around doing what they like, and there is collateral damage. If you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes, don't you? And that's what these people do.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of the Tony Long story. Part 3 will be released shortly on Xjob Downloaded. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Xjob Downloaded. Please like, follow and share. Your support is invaluable. Thank you.